All right, AP Human Geo folks, this lecture is going to probably be a multi-series lecture, but this will be over political geography in your Rubenstein text, that's chapter 8. But chapter 8 actually leaves out a pretty good amount of information that you're going to need to know. So we're going to go over it. Some of it may be a little bit of review. Feel free to fast forward or pause or stop wherever you need to. But when we talk about political geography, obviously it's a subset of geography that looks at the interplay between geography and politics, or government systems. We actually already talked about in class the word geopolitics, and geopolitics being the idea that a state's ability to really control territory also then has a great deal of influence on how it interacts with other states and foreign policies and just relationships. So when we talk about states, it's really important to remember that a state is just a synonym for the word country. That's kind of our more common language. But a state is an independent political unit with recognized boundaries. The word sovereignty should come to mind here, and that's the idea that a state has power over its own territory and its own people. So a little bit of a different idea is the word nation. A nation, a lot of times we use synonymously with a country. However, that's not the case in AP Human Geography. A nation is simply a group of people sharing certain elements of culture, including language, religion, history, or maybe even political identity. They do not necessarily have to live in a common geographic area. So an example of this would be the Jewish nation. The Jewish nation would probably include groups of people that would self-identify as either Jewish ethnically or Jewish religiously, and they don't necessarily all live together. Obviously, there's a large population of Jewish people, nearly 6 million of them in the United States, and approximately 5.5 to 6 million of them living in Israel. And so it would be not unheard of to hear of someone say, I'm a member of the Jewish nation, if they were living in New York, or if they were living in Israel, or if it was just a Jewish person living in, say, Europe or a part of Africa or the Middle East or whatnot. They would say maybe they belong to a Jewish nation. Another good example of this would be like Royals fans. So Royals Nation. A lot of times we kind of hear it called that in a very informal way, but it's sort of an allegiance to a group of people that share a certain element of culture, and in this case, it would be Royals baseball sort of fandom. And you could find Royals sort of nation, obviously around Kauffman Stadium and around the Kansas City area, but if someone moves away, let's say they move to Washington, D.C., and they remain very loyal to the Royals, okay, they could say, I'm still a member of Royals Nation. When we talk about AP Human Geography, this comes to play when we talk specifically about ethnic groups and areas where people have a nation that is also perfectly sort of enclosed within a state. If this was the case, we would call it a nation state. So if every single member of an ethnicity was actually enclosed within a territory of a state, that would be a perfect nation state. However, there is no perfect example of a nation state. A good example, though, would be Japan. Very few people from Japan leave the Japan territory or state, and very few outsiders actually come in or immigrate into Japan. And so, therefore, it's a really pretty homogenous group of people governed by their own state. And the government also sort of reflects that homogenous sort of identity. So nation states actually develop, the very first ones are going to be developed in Europe, and they're going to use lines, boundaries along the lines of language in order to try to group people that are homogenous. The more homogenous the group of people, typically, the easier it is to form feelings of nationalism. When we talk about the state shapes, there are several different ones. Keep in mind, I'm not going to go over them too intensively because we did it in class, but keep in mind, it's also in your book, advantages and disadvantages of each state shape. So compact states, obviously, equidistant from the center or roughly so, great for communication, has some weaknesses though. Proruption are going to be ones that have a little arm or something that actually kind of erupts away from it. I always think of a volcano eruption with a stream of lava flowing away from the volcano itself. In this case, a proruption is sort of a stream of land that flows away from the main land. The most important thing to know about a proruption is that typically they are reaching out in order to hit resources or grab resources. And again, you have some disadvantages. They're awfully vulnerable. Fragmentation. Fragmentation is non-contiguous land within a state. A good example of that would be maybe being Denmark here. Other examples would be the Philippines. The United States is a great example because we have Hawaii and Alaska. Elongated states. Elongated states, probably the best example is Chile. And again, think about, okay, benefits are they have a great deal of coastline. However, one of the sort of disadvantages of that is it's hard to defend and there's communication barriers. Malawi is a good example, and your book also offers the Gambia. Perforated states. Perforated states are the states that completely surround another state. There are only a few examples of these. South Africa is an example surrounding Lesotho, and additionally, Italy actually surrounding the Vatican City. Again, there's some advantages to this. They could actually sort of influence trade and or tax the country that is inside their territory. That's an advantage. A disadvantage, though, is that you do have some centrifugal force, so something that's sort of different inside your country that could always cause a little bit of conflict. When we ask ourselves about, okay, for example, the Lesotho or the Vatican City, what would we call those states? Well, those states obviously are landlocked. They also happen to be compact, just the way in which they're drawn, but your book does not offer this and you'll need to know it. They are called enclaves. An enclave is a country or a part of a country that is completely surrounded by another. So Lesotho or Vatican City are good examples of enclave. If you have a hard time remembering this, look at the first four letters, encla. Okay, and think of enclosure. So they are enclosed entirely by another country. An exclave is a part of a state that is separated from the mainland of its state. So a really good example of this is Russia with Kaliningrad. Kaliningrad is apart from the rest of Russia, and it is actually separated by land, and so it would be considered an exclave. If you look again at the prefix ex, it means out. Think of the word exit or external. Azerbaijan is another good example of it. An exclave, they have an exclave that is separated between with Armenia, sort of separating it from its mainland of Azerbaijan. Another good example of this is Alaska. Alaska is an exclave of the United States, separated, of course, by Canada. When we talk about boundaries, keep in mind that boundaries are a vertical plane, typically an invisible vertical plane between states. They cut through the rocks below and all the way through airspace above. They are created to regulate and control groups of people and also the resources within them. They can be inclusionary and exclusionary, so the purposes could be to include or sort of enclose people, or it could be to actually keep people out. It can also be formal or informal. Formal would be de jure spaces, those would be by law. Informal would be not by law. When we talk about boundaries, boundaries are created in order to delimit an area over which a state would have control, or a good sort of synonym there again with state exercising control over an area is state sovereignty. So a territory would be an area where a state has sovereignty and is recognized by other states. Some examples of borders or boundaries in the past. This used to be a very formal boundary between China and, of course, the Mongols. However, today it's an informal boundary. Today, this is actually the border between the US and Mexico. This is a formal boundary, again, by law. Interesting example here. This is an informal boundary from, I would say, most people. It could have some very formal repercussions, especially in the 90s when gangs were kind of really alive and well in Los Angeles, and their turfs were so well known that it was actually published. This would be informal spaces, but still a very real example of territories. US-Canada border today is a formal boundary. It used to be a little bit less stringent. You could actually walk across the border without a passport or checkpoints, but since 9/11, we actually have really secured the borders a little bit more there. Other examples of formal borders or boundaries would be the Louisiana Purchase boundaries, of course, outlined and then bought by the United States from France, 1803. Here's an example of informal boundaries. This map sort of shows boundaries between certain Native American areas, but again, this is an informal thing and not necessarily a formal statehood or region. And then another good example here is the Berlin Wall, and that was, again, a very formal boundary, something that was actually by law created, of course, to separate East Berliners in a exclusionary boundary from West Berlin. When we talk about boundaries, we also have to consider the way in which a boundary comes about. So as boundaries are drawn, they are actually created first in a definitional sense. A definitional boundary or definition boundary is a legal document or treaty drawn up in order to define where the boundary will be. Typically, this is actually done at a treaty, some sort of treaty meeting, sort of Congress, some sort of, again, meeting, hopefully, where people are sitting down and negotiating territory and making those decisions. Good examples of this, of course, would be in Berlin, the Congress of Berlin, when the European countries took the African map and they decided basically where to define each other's colonial boundaries. Other examples would be the let's say Treaty of Versailles, or really it would be the League of Nations that would maybe decide where the new boundaries of Europe are going to be post World War I. The limitation boundary would be cartographers actually putting the boundary on the map. The way that I think of this one is you really do not know the limitations of your country's boundaries unless it is mapped out for you. No one just walks around automatically knowing where the 49th parallel is, and so therefore you wouldn't know as you walked across it that you're entering Canada or entering the United States, unless you had, of course, it delimited on a map. And that map will then set it apart so that everybody knows about it. So the first thing is to define the boundary, the second thing is to delimit the boundary, and then the third thing is actually optional. The third thing is to demarcate the boundary. Demarcated boundaries are marked on the ground, actually physically shown on the landscape. This is really expensive and pretty impractical for most borders to be marcated, but there are some places of the world that have demarcated boundaries. This is actually a good example. These are just sort of fence posts, or they're concrete posts that are showing the border between the United States and Canada in some spots. Typically, a lot of countries do not have demarcated boundaries, particularly if they're fairly cooperative and have sort of open movement and free movement of people between the countries. But there are some areas of the world that have very strictly and sort of formally imposed demarcated boundaries. A good example of this would be the wall that's being built between the United States and Mexico. It will actually be physically marked on the ground with a wall or fence of some sort. When we talk about boundaries, we also have to consider how and sort of where boundaries originate or how they are created. There's a couple different examples. Antecedent boundaries are ones that exist before an area is populated. A really good example of this would be between the US and Canada. The US and Canada decide where that boundary is going to be. They draw the line, and then later settlers actually move in and develop cultural landscapes that differ from one another depending on which side of the boundary that they settle on. A subsequent boundary is one that's actually established after the area has already been populated. If you think about A, antecedent, A comes first. Okay, so that is the idea that the boundary comes before people show up. Subsequent, okay, sub meaning after or below, okay, and that is after people have actually showed up. A good example of this might be like India and Pakistan, and the idea that there were already sort of sociocultural, religious differences between the areas, and so therefore they put a subsequent boundary on the landscape. A superimposed boundary is one. If you look at the word super, super meaning like above or powerful, is placed by powerful outsiders on top of a developed landscape. A good example of this is actually during the age of imperialism, European countries going in and drawing boundaries on top of pre-existing people. And unfortunately, superimposed boundaries often did not take into consideration pre-existing issues like ethnic groups that did not get along. And that's how you have situations like Rwanda, where you have two different ethnic groups sort of clustered into and drawn within the same boundary that maybe don't get along. Another example would be in Africa, actually European boundaries dividing up ethnic groups that had previously been homogenous and had a sort of element of self-rule. The last one is a relic boundary. This is a pretty easy one. A relic boundary, a relic should be the idea sort of it's old or ancient. Sometimes we use the word relic to talk about an artifact. It ceased to function, so it's no longer a functioning boundary, but its imprint can usually still be seen on the landscape. A good example of this would be the Great Wall of China, maybe where the east-west Berlin Wall was, and they actually have that marked in several places across Germany, across Berlin rather. It's not actually a functional thing. It's not enacted anymore. Another example might be Hadrian's Wall, showing the extent of the Roman Empire all the way up in Great Britain. So those are the sort of origins of boundaries and where they come from. In the next video, we'll actually look at the types of boundary conflicts that can occur.